Countries clashed over a proposed agreement to phase out fossil fuels at the COP28 climate summit in Dubai on Saturday. Observers in the negotiations said Saudi Arabia and Russia were among several countries insisting the conference focus only on reducing climate pollution and not on targeting fossil fuels. At least 80 countries, including the US, European Union, and many poor, climate-vulnerable nations, are demanding a COP28 deal that calls clearly for an eventual end to fossil fuel use.
Mr. President, these COPs have been going on for a very long time.
An official with the oil-producing group OPEC addressed delegates.
Ultimately, this all-energy, all-people, and all-technologies approach need to be in adherence to the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities.
Earlier this week, OPEC sent a letter urging its members and allies to reject any mention of fossil fuels in the final deal. The letter was criticized by the EU's climate commissioner.
It is clear that by many, including by me, that has been seen as out of whack, as unhelpful.
Other countries, including India and China, have not explicitly endorsed a fossil fuel phase-out, but have backed a popular call for boosting renewable energy. China's top climate diplomat described this year's climate summit as the hardest in his career. Climate-vulnerable countries said a rejection of a fossil fuel mention at COP28 would threaten the entire world.
The science tells us that these commitments are crucial.
A sentiment echoed by protesters in Dubai.
And we're here to say how mega corporations and fossil fuels industry is melting the planet. We're here to defend and phase out fossil fuels.
COP28's president told nations on Saturday to speed up their work, saying there were currently more areas of divergence than agreement.
The window is closing to close the gaps.
The summit is scheduled to end on Tuesday.
Your Excellency, you have the floor.
We will not go silently to our watery graves. Therefore, we cannot and will not accept an outcome from the COP that does not set us on a course for a future that stays within 1.5 temperature, mirrored in technicality. We will not leave here accepting an outcome that does anything less than protecting a safe future in our territory.
Of Solomon Islands. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. President, these COPs have been going on for a very long time. Our children and youths are expecting us to do the right and the needful. And that is to arrest, reverse, and stop greenhouse gas emissions to rein in climate change. But it is very clear that we cannot negotiate with climate change. And those of us that are disproportionately impacted by it urge parties with historical responsibilities and other major emitters, for that matter, to emancipate yourselves from fossil fuel addiction. I thank you.
Climate change of Vanuatu. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
For COP28 to be a success, I repeat, it needs to deliver both on fossil fuel phase-out, renewables, and an end to fossil fuel subsidies. The science tells us that these commitments are crucial to meeting a 1.5-degree aligned pathway. We have seen and heard some progress made in the negotiation rooms. We call for a robust GST decision, one that guides and commits actions by parties to reduce emissions by phasing out fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies and scaling up renewable energy with sufficient finance, technology, and capacity building support.
Speaking on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
We know that these stocktakes will happen every 5 years, but this is the one that matters for keeping the 1.5 limit within reach. To be true leaders, we must extend our spirit of service to all people. And the agreement to fully operationalize the Santiago network on loss and damage. Crucially, a target for renewables cannot be a substitute for a stronger commitment to fossil fuel phase-out and an end to fossil fuel subsidies. COP28 needs to deliver both. Excellencies, we must never move away from what we have all agreed at COP21 in Paris.
The country, the joint declaration of intent, the support of instrument. Part of this restoration strategy is all about aligning to this strategic environmental outcomes. Okay, anybody else?
We should take into account the reality of producing countries, the reality of some countries that highly depend on that resource and will not put their populations at risk. But that's why we need a plan, a global plan that considers all those situations. Even Colombia, that depends on the export of coal. We are the 5th largest export of coal country, and also on oil. We need to make that economic transition, and it's not easy. I can tell you that not necessarily working on this transition has full international support as it should be. So my call for them will be to get into the table and let's talk about those economic consequences.
Phasing out fossil fuels, particularly countries like Saudi Arabia.
If we don't get with the goals in 2030 of emission reduction, probably we will have to say to our citizens that we were not going to be able to achieve the limit of 1.5 to stabilize the climate towards the end of the century. So a lot of is at stake, but of course there's very opposite interests at play, and hopefully we get the most closer to the ambitious side of things rather than the most conservative one.
It would be a proposal to help you structure the conservation and restoration money, but of course our main resources are...
Yes, and this is the report I have from our negotiators, and so it's trying to keep things status quo, no? More of an attitude. But the reality is that we can't do that. For example, just Colombia had 1 million victims of flooding and landslides in 2022 because of 3 years of La Niña. Climate change is getting worse. So we need to address this, and this needs to be addressed fast, and we need to understand that producers and consumers of oil, big emitters, are generating in most vulnerable countries and populations dramatic chaos.
The issue at the heart of COP28 in Dubai is whether it will be the first UN climate conference to produce a global agreement to phase out fossil fuels. They're the biggest cause of climate change, and fossil fuels still produce around 80% of the world's energy. Here's a look at who's pushing for a deal. Norway, the US, Canada, Chile, Colombia, and some African nations, including Kenya and Ethiopia, are among the 80 countries seeking a deal. The European Union is also on board. Here's Climate Commissioner Wopke Hoekstra.
I want this COP to mark the beginning of the end for fossil fuels. This is a key part for the EU and for our negotiating mandates, meaning that all 27 European member states want this to be part of the negotiated outcome.
Opposition to a fossil fuel phase-out is led by Russia, Saudi Arabia, and China, diplomats said. Representatives of some African nations have said they could support a phase-out deal if wealthy countries agree to quit first. Uganda's energy minister said a deal could be acceptable if it allowed developing nations to exploit their resources in the near term. Asking the country to stop using fossil fuels, she said, was like asking Uganda to stay in poverty. Diplomats and observers told Reuters that some countries, like Saudi Arabia and China, have consistently raised the issue of equity at the talks, emphasizing the high historical contribution of wealthy nations to climate change. But some said they doubted whether these nations would support a deal even if the equity issue was addressed. Another sticking point is whether the deal should allow for continued consumption if emissions are captured or abated. Diplomats say Saudi Arabia, a top oil producer, wants this kind of deal. But the tech is expensive and not used at scale. The UN's Climate Science Panel says it sees a limited role for carbon capture to zero out the world's emissions by 2050. The US and EU support a COP28 deal that recognizes these technologies with limits. Irish Climate Minister Eamon Ryan says it can help in some sectors.
There will be a small amount abated, in hard-to-reach sectors, cement, steel, other areas. But that can't be a get-out-of-jail card for international fossil fuel companies, cover for kind of technological wish that, we're going to invent this new technology to eat up all the carbon.
The UN's climate science panel says steep fossil fuel cuts are needed to avert more severe climate change.